well, thank you.
Well, thank you for doing this, and to all the people on the call. I can see there's quite a lot of people on the call. Thank you to all of you for joining the call, but especially thank you to Carl for agreeing to this presentation. Carl is the CEO of Coltronics, which is a company which he probably won't tell you about now because he's got more important, exciting things to talk to you about this morning, but certainly speak to me about it. It's a fantastic corporation, and that is down to the incredible leadership of Carl. And I think what's also amazing about it, and he's going to get very embarrassed now, but not only is he brilliant as a technical innovator in relation to what that corporation does and what great things it's done for this country, advancing the technology of this country, especially in the maritime sector, but also as a leader of people and a visionary in the way that he leads his team and the way that he's respected. He's one of the most impressive individuals I've come across in all my time on this planet so far. And he's a thoroughly wonderful person as well. And somehow, as well as managing to run and do an awful lot of stuff with UK government, he finds time to be passionate about important issues such as the one that he's going to speaking to you today about, which is the issue of modern slavery. So without more ado, Carl, thank you very much, and let me hand over to you.
Julian, thank you. I'd also like to thank Sophia, and who, by the way, you know, will go far in your company if the last few minutes have been any guide. She's a real beacon of hope for law in our country, in my view. Julian, you as are you. You are one of the world's leading maritime lawyers, and you're an exceptional friend and husband. So good morning to you all. I just, before I go on, I would like to reaffirm my thanks to Julian, Sophia, Fiona Robson and Victoria Yates for organising this, and thank you to you for giving some time out of your busy day. I warmly encourage you in your careers because I happen to believe rule of law is the most fundamental basis for equal opportunity and humankind, and its distinguishing characteristic in our country, with its roots that stretch back to divinity itself, in a sense, if I may say that, without imposing any faith view on anybody. So I've prepared an address for you, and please, if any of you get bored, can you please just, put your camera on and tell me to stop. But firstly, I'd just like to say thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today about my thoughts on the eradication of modern slavery at sea. Firstly, of course, you of all people know very well that London remains the world's maritime centre, and you know why the UK remains a lead maritime nation. But our country in its modern sense was founded on the sea, and you are playing a key part in enabling that extraordinary trade that we do, which is now at the heart of British foreign policy itself, if you think about it, through the integrated review on foreign security and development policy that was released earlier this year. Many of us here today view the work of government through the prism of what we hear in the news. And it's no surprise that if we do that we conclude that EU exit and COVID-19 has blocked all good work. But how many of us here today would know that this government has applied some of what I think is the greatest strategic thought I've seen in 25 years, from the export strategy from the Department for International Trade, the industrial strategy from BEIS, the environment strategy from DEFRA, and in our own industry, Maritime 2050, the first 30-year strategy. Thanks for coming online, Julian. I need to see somebody, so thank you. And in our own industry, Maritime 2050, a 30-year strategy, and the first one that we've done in 300 or 400 years from the Department for Transport. And I praise and commend the exceptional civil servants at the Maritime Directorate, part of the DFT. But on top of that, we've also done some things that really knock out of the park any notion that either COVID-19 or EU exit was going to disable in some way the UK's connection to the rest of the world. So the integrated review defines our role in the world as a force for good. And that to me is underpinned by how we view and rely on rule of law, which is why I made my comments earlier about your careers. But in June, we also renewed the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter between the UK and the US that was put together in 1945 and shaped our modern world has now been refreshed so that we can do it all again 70 odd years later. We've recently then put together AUKUS between the Australians, the United Kingdom and the US as a vital component really to what effectively is an effort to maintain the rules-based international system and the laws therein. So I ask, if any of you haven't read them, please do, because if you do, you would restore some hope if you have begun to lose it. If we think about the marine industry, there's a wonderful phrase, which is that they that go down to the sea in ships that do business in great waters. And in a sense, that's what you're doing from your offices. You are enabling those ships and those people who work in ships to do great work in great waters. My company does business in ships. Julian's been exceptionally kind. I was a little embarrassed about that, and I won't go on much about it, but broadly, my company is a high exporting advanced and manufacturer, exporting 89% of what we make to 120 countries. I am proud to say that we went through COVID-19 without putting one person into furlough. And the organization as a whole, I'm very proud to tell you now, first time publicly we've said it really, except in writing, is that it comprises the company, the Durham Institute of Research, Development and Invention at Durham University, which has taken us 3 years to get Senate approval for that, and which we only recently received. Within the Institute, the Centre for Underwater Acoustic Analysis to support the work of the Royal Navy, and our new laboratory, which is co-located with the Centre for Advanced Instrumentation, which is part of the Department of Physics at Durham. I'm going to assume that we're all in London, even though I told Sophia that I'm actually in the country at the moment in Somerset, but we are in the world's great maritime centre if we think of London in that sense. I encourage you to read Maritime 2050 and respond to the call of our government to play your part in a spirit of public service to implement it. Our civil servants, in my view, at their best, are the jewel in our national crown. And whilst they receive a lot of negative press in the newspapers, I've had 4 years intensive experience across 7 or 8 departments of state. And I can tell you that the best of them are people that we should be exceptionally proud of, as I am of you in your company, by the way. And I warmly commend you to get to know Julian if you don't already, because he is a singularly magnificent man. But but can any of you know what percentage of UK companies in the shipping industry, in ships, had a written procedure on confined space entry? The answer is 31%. But if I ask you how many of the companies have implemented their own processes, I can tell you that it's 0%. And one of the reasons why men and women still don't come out of those confined spaces on ships alive. So what does that tell any of us as the maritime professionals who we are? Is the problem one of regulation or implementation? And if it is the latter, might each of us ask whether now is not the time to exert our own leadership in our own industry? No need to answer me, but just ask yourselves, what are the qualities and characteristics of leadership? It can consist of a wide spectrum, from bravery and courage, which I've seen as a former soldier, but I'm not saying I was any of those things myself, but I certainly witnessed them when I was a younger green jacket officer. It can be subject matter expertise, which you have in abundance, and the ability to influence those around you, and 100 other things in between. But are each of us acting as leaders in our industry? Is government leading us as the maritime nation that we are? Why are ships still lost at sea? Why is sinking still the #1 reason for losing ships at sea? And why is fire still the #2 reason? And why are hundreds of seafarers and maritime professionals still dying in peacetime? Why are the worst operators in our global industry still employing people in a state of modern slavery on our worst ships? I commend those at the top end of our industry, I worry greatly about those at the bottom. Think in your words now of a definition of a company. There are hundreds. In my traveling life, I used to go to airport bookstores and read them in management books. But after 25 years in business, I offer you mine. A definition of a company is no more than the sum of the individuals within it. Think now of a definition of the leader of your organization. My own is to create a happy and dynamic environment for those individuals within the company so that we create a sustainable and profitable one. So how have we arrived at the point we have in shipping now, where the assets that we have in the ships that we crew, in some of them, are crewed by some of the cheapest labor on earth, recruited 1,000 miles from a coastline? As I mentioned, I used to be a soldier. My regiment, the Green Jackets, is a rifle regiment and the sister regiment of the Brigade of Gurkhas. Years ago, I was attached to them and had the privilege of seeing the recruitment of young Gurkha riflemen from the foothills of the Himalayas in Nepal. Some had never seen running water from a tap or tied a bootlace. Here in our country, we hold the Gurkhas in the highest regards. There are no bad Gurkha soldiers, just bad commanders. Yet in our pursuit of the cheapest Nepalis who are now recruited to go to sea, and with many others from other developing nations, being employed in the state of modern poverty on some very poorly run ships. Is that not above all a failure of leadership in our industry by some of our peers? I began in shipping 25 years ago. I'd grown up in port cities in Australia, Canada, and Singapore. My father had been in submarines, and he was the basis of the company that we have today. But when we began, I visited your peers. I met some of the finest master mariners and chief engineers in the world, but I also met some who were far less. In those days, the world fleet consisted of 40,000 ships, operated by 8,000 ship owners. I don't know whether you believe it, but over 5 years, I visited 3,000 of them. Many of your predecessors listened to our ideas on maritime safety. Some were engaged, others less so. Some even swore at the very idea itself, that they should be concerned that their ships would not extinguish the fires that they had on their vessels or in the cargoes that they carried. Today, I'm proud to say that we're in service with 10,000 ships. In other words, nearly 20% of the world's fleet are sufficiently concerned to have our instrumentation on board so that they can minimize the risk of fires. But they are the best operators, those who care, and the same ones who lead our industry. But the world fleet is now 55,000 ships. So that leaves 35,000 vessels that have no concerns at all that their CO2 extinguishing system, the very system that protects their ship from fire, the number 2 reason for ships being lost at sea, have insufficient concern to monitor the contents of that gas so that they could extinguish the fire event if it occurs. The regulations are clear from the IMO that the ship must have the means for the crew to check the contents of the CO2 system. It's clear why. If they don't check it, they won't know it'll work when they need it. But no one ashore can when the ship is at sea. Anything pressurized can leak. CO2 is at 720 pounds per square inch of pressure. That is 40 to 50 bar. It will leak, therefore, and sometimes discharge. The failure of 35,000 ships in our world fleet not to be so equipped is a failure of leadership, surely. And one of the reasons why every week we read of yet another ship with an uncontrollable fire. Julian knows that I've traveled to 30 plus countries annually for 25 years. I've been away for 4 to 5 months a year until 4 years ago. More time by far than ever when I served in the military. I met some of those world's leading master mariners and chief engineers, and they guided and assisted us as a company, and they've certainly guided me as a man. To become who we are today, the world's leading manufacturer of systems to protect ships in 2 specialized areas is a great privilege for me. Some of you here today will also be maybe fellows of the Institute of Marine Engineering or fellows of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, or like Julian, a member of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners. But all of you are my fellows in our industry, and therefore we're meant to be learned, and we are the industry's leaders, whether we like it or not. So a few years ago, I stopped flying. I decided I wanted to support our government, to use the time that I used to spend traveling, seeing what I could do in public service. I've now supported in modest ways 8 departments of state, and in a very modest way, I supported our 30-year maritime strategy in Maritime 2050 across 3 areas. One was the application of UK values in the global maritime domain. Second was close to my company's work in maritime safety. But third was in the eradication of modern slavery at sea. And that took 2 years and is now a commitment of the British government, and it's contained in Maritime 2050 if you wish to download it. It's a 378-page document, but I am proud to say that our government has made a commitment to eradicate modern slavery at sea. In Maritime 50, there are a few key points. The first of these is that the government was determined that the UK maintains itself in our global industry as a premium brand, uncompromising on safety. The second was to make a commitment to the rules-based international system. The third was to do that in the context of a global United Kingdom. And fourthly, to do all of that within a government-industry partnership. Interestingly enough, this year in the integrated review, trade and finance are placed at the heart of British foreign policy for the first time in 200 years. And the Defence Command paper, its accompanying document, reverses our military strategy for the last 30 years since the Cold War to a maritime strategy overall. So I ask you, please call the Maritime 2050 team at DFT, at the Department for Transport, to see how you can place a little bit of your time in the implementation of Maritime 2050. Before I go on to eradicating modern slavery at sea, let's just take 3 issues and examine the synergies that they have in their safety outcomes in the maritime domain and identify what we can do to resolve them. In confined space entry, the regulations state that every ship must have on board oxygen monitors and flammable and toxic gas monitors. So we have the kit on board every ship to protect life at sea. We've written the procedures for their use based on the fundamental underlying science, as we should, and their engineering and technical implications. So why are mariners losing their lives every year at sea when they enter a confined space and stay there dead? If the kit is aboard and the procedures for their use are written, the only possible reason that they die is in our industry's failure to lead those people that enter them, whether from the masters or chief engineers aboard those vessels, or perhaps from their head office ashore. That is a consequence, a fatal consequence of poor leadership. The second example would be in carbon dioxide contents at sea, which is used to extinguish fires in the unmanned spaces aboard a ship, such as an engine space. A ship depends for its CO2 system to protect against fire at sea. It's stored in up to 645 kilogram cylinders and stored under the pressures I described above. The master and chief engineer are trained as to its location, what its effect on fire will be, how to actuate it, and how to conduct a simple visual inspection of it. Yet none of them are actually trained in the science behind it or its physical characteristics. They understand that it can asphyxiate, yet we still have mariners dying at sea because of asphyxiation when it discharges under test. We know that it's a liquid gas stored under pressure and that it vaporizes on discharge and expands by volume, which gives it its underlying fire extinguishing characteristic. Yet we also know, because we supply the very marine servicing companies that are meant to check that equipment, that the equipment to test for its contents, that in somewhere like Dubai, for instance, they report that the average CO2 contents deficiency is 20%. That means 1 in 5 ships that come into Dubai knowingly are incapable of extinguishing the fires that may accrue after they leave port, because they know that the CO2 that they're managing is not capable of extinguishing that fire. So that leaves the ship below the threshold at which sufficient design concentration can be generated in the event of a fire to put it out. Why is that? I suggest that it's because the worst of our ship owners do not want the CO2 system maintained. They want the certificate issued by the company to say that it was, but they don't care the underlying work that justifies the certification. And the reason they want the certification is for the insurance purpose of it, to protect their asset financially. In China, it's even worse. We know that 80% of Chinese flagged vessels are deficient in their CO2 systems, and every year mariners die. Ships are lost to fire. I wonder whether any of us study the MCA accident investigation reports. They're some of the best in the world. How many of the accident reports, however, reference the contents of the CO2 system? All of these examples combine not to a lack of regulations, nor to their written procedures, but to a lack of leadership and their proper implementation. In the way we crew our vessels, some of the worst operators think that the cheapest crew is best, and some think that there should be worse than that, to allow mariners to exist in the state of modern slavery that they do, and that's the opposite of good leadership and humane kindness. Which is why in Maritime 2050, our government is committed to eradicate modern slavery at sea in the next 10 to 15 years. I believe we will be the first nation on earth to do that, combining our maritime with our fine naval traditions that abolished slavery in the 19th century, and to eradicate its modern form today at sea. That is an act of leadership by our government, and all of us in this meeting can play our part to inform, advise and command, to work with government as a core UK value, just as you are doing in your careers, applying a core UK distinguishing value in the rule of law. That is leadership. So here is some data which you may be interested. In all the three cases I've mentioned, your peers in our industry had the wherewithal to identify problems and generate the policies that led to the regulations at home and applied by our flag state and the MCA and globally at the international maritime organizations, of which our country is the lead maritime nation and the reason that the IMO is headquartered just across from Parliament in London. It's the reason that its headquarters are here. We sit on its committees, but the regulations that generate the equipment that are the tools to solve the problems, and in turn the regulations and the equipment that generate the working procedures, so that both combine to a cohesive whole to preserve life at sea, and it's called SOLAS. And the best of our operators sail in good faith that their mariners will be safe. For when we go on great ships to do great business, we have enough risk to cater for from winds and seas. But our greatest failures lie on our worst practices, and that is about us, and whether we can look the world in the eye and say that we led. The UK legislated for the land-based equivalent of the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. So it is literally only 6 years ago that our government brought, that we, the people, effectively brought legislation to our parliament to eradicate modern slavery on land. This provides very helpful text which could be used in the eradication of slavery at sea. It can be dealt with as an amendment to the International Safety Management Code, the ISM, because the Secretary General of the IMO is determined to keep this issue of eradication of modern slavery at sea with the IMO rather than delegate it to the ILO in Geneva. Why is that? It's because he considers the human element, as he calls it, critical to maritime safety overall. This therefore provides our international maritime standard for the safe management and operations of ships at sea. I suggest to you privately that text could be drafted by your office, and that I will then take that to the Department for Transport in the Maritime Directorate so that they can propose it to the Secretary General, because it's a UN body that requires a member state to take it to the floor of the General Assembly and propose it. At that stage, I anticipate being advised whether this will be initiated as a wider EU instrument perhaps, or as a UK specific one now that the UK has left the EU. I'll be seeking the support of allies and friends in Parliament and government to guide me on UK government specific aspects as they arise. But you in your company, if you wish to help, could do the work that the government is actually too stretched sometimes to do itself. It would be very helpful if you would wish to join me and I hope I'm not overstepping my mark, Julian, by saying that. And if I am, please neutralize what I said after this call. Overall, however, I anticipate the central and binding rationale for support within the government being their declared objective, which they have themselves stated in their wish to eradicate modern slavery at sea within their own Maritime 2050 strategy. For me, I've spent a wonderful career in over 30 years in shipping. I've traveled to 30 to 40 countries a year, and I've worked with some of the world's most excellent shipping and ship management companies. But throughout that time, I've seen a state of sea blindness worsen across the developed world, and specifically in my country, where 96% of everything one touches arrives by sea. At the same time, I've seen crewing agencies recruit from some of the poorest countries on earth, and a state of modern slavery at sea exists in some of the world's worst run shipping companies. It is an act of inhumanity upon the world's poorest by some of the world's wealthiest. Shipping enables global trade. The UK and the developed world are largely sea blind as to its material or its strategic significance. It is an industry that at its best is one populated by men and women who care deeply for its highest integrity. But the majority of it globally operates at a level that includes tax evasion, tax avoidance, a devotion to cheapness, and a disregard for the human condition. These are some of the reasons why the United Kingdom is committed in Maritime 2050 to placing its values at its heart, to being a premier global maritime nation predicated on maritime safety. It's why the United Kingdom is committed to the eradication of modern slavery at sea in Maritime 2050, and the very reason why the United Kingdom has constructed in that strategy document its first 30-year strategy in its 500 years as a leading maritime nation of the world. Globally, our industry has more collisions at sea and more failures of hull and machinery in 2016 to 18 than we did in 2014 to 16. We've more vessels at sea than we've ever had. Our shipyards are at capacity globally, and we've determined that buying the cheapest ships in China is part of our professional way of life. Our seafarers have never been cheaper in relative terms, and nor has been the cost of shipping itself to the consumer, disregarding COVID-19, who, far from appreciating this, believes that most imports come to the UK by air rather than by ship. The reason the British government has determined maritime safety as one of its central policy issues in Maritime 2050 is, I imagine, because it is well aware that the worst of our industry globally is unsafe. For 70 years, we have known of the dangers of seafarers entering confined spaces and remaining in them dead. So we crafted technically based regulations and demanded that portable monitors were available, as I said earlier, and for the crew to use on entry to them, but they still die. This is a failure of implementation, and implementation occurs in an environment where leadership is good and where the well-being of those under command are leaders' first duty. The old maxim of crew, ship and cargo, and managing in that priority, is as true today as it was 500 years ago. But that changed, and we must now halt its worst practices. Best practice does exist, but it only exists in our best operators, and these, I have to say, are a minority in our industry overall. Over the last 20 years, the growth of ship management is attributable to the lower cost advantage it gave to the owner on a technical, crewing, and commercial management basis. That is not to say that the world's best ship management companies are managing inappropriately, more that it reveals that the owner's interest is in lower cost overall. Where an owner becomes overly obsessed with cost at its lowest, one will also find the worst operators and the worst practices that in other sectors of industry would be illegal. So what is a shipping company's structure? I'm hesitant here because I know how professional each of you will be on this call. And so I say this with some sadness. The owner might be based in London or Hamburg or Athens. The ship might be registered as a single purpose company, registered in the most tax efficient domicile, such as an offshore location for tax purposes. The ship might be flagged in Panama or Liberia, the two most common flag states globally. The ship may be classed under any number of classification societies, and it is no coincidence that owners appoint high-quality classification societies whilst being regulated in the lowest quality domiciles. The reason is simple. If they do not, then their cargo owners or charterers will not use them. The officers and crews will be recruited from the lowest labor rate countries on earth. That is why the industry is manning itself with Filipinos earning on average $3,104 per annum. Through to that revered nation, maritime nation, Burma, whose seafarers are employed on board our ships at an average of £1,490 per annum. And today, Nepal too, which comes in at top billing, with an average seafarer from Nepal earning $775 per annum. And whose nearest port, interestingly enough, from Nepal is 400 miles away in the Bay of Bengal. Those figures are from the worst owners, by the way. Please, I understand that you may be resisting them. This is before we get to provision the vessel. And if there is one thing we can all understand, it is the ship chandler who will tell anyone that the majority of contracts are won on price alone. So the cheapest food, the cheapest water, and the cheapest rope itself. Neither Liberia nor Panama have a maritime tradition, excepting in the cheapness of their national ships' registers. The texts by which they are reputed bear resemblance to best practice, but how can they enforce those same regulations? In the UK, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, the MCA, struggles to maintain its establishment of 128 highly qualified former master mariners and former chief engineers to be its inspectors and surveyors. How many of their counterparts can possibly exist in Panama or Liberia? Whilst the UK maritime sector constantly concerns itself with the Maritime Coast Guard Agency and the Maritime Accidents Investigations Board, which incidentally generates some of the finest marine accident reports globally that the world has ever seen, what conference have any of us attended at any time in the last 30 years where speakers have expressed devotion and concern as to Liberia or Panama's equivalent establishment to the MCA, or commented in reverential terms as to the quality of their maritime accident reports? If we are to improve maritime safety, we have to accept that the only way for free markets work is when governments can become their hidden hand in them to prevent the consequence of unfettered markets. We know this from Adam Smith itself. And the only genuinely free markets that I've ever seen anywhere on this planet are illegal ones. The next best thing to an unfettered market is a tax haven, and shipping has convinced itself that it needs them to remain low cost. Tax evasion is never about anything other than greed, surely. The border between it and illegality is fine. Greed will become its own value, and it is done in the worst of our global shipping companies. It is why you will find a coincidence in the numbers of total catastrophic insurance claims during recessions. Think of what I've just said. Ships lost at sea with all hands, often in the deepest parts of the ocean too, often well away from trade routes, too deep to find. The ship owner prizes their asset very highly, but its insurance claim value just as much. The IMO recently marked its 70th anniversary in London, and I have already proposed to the Secretary General Kai-Tak Lim that we should mark it by eradicating modern slavery at sea to mark its next more promising 70 years. We have produced master mariners who cannot always exercise their duties of compassionate leadership upon officers and crew who, at its worst, we have internationally commoditized. It is surely our duty and obligation to uphold our common humanity on land and at sea. For the oceans are the world's real superhighway. The IMO leads in maritime. The UK is a lead maritime nation, with 90% of all our trade reliant upon our seas. In 2015, the UK enshrined in law the Modern Slavery Act. But in our maritime industry, surely now is the time to achieve the decommoditization of our global workforce at sea and eradicate its slavery practices at sea. I would be happy if you would join me in a spirit of public service to our industry to help eradicate it now, building on the finest traditions of Wilberforce, who in turn stimulated the Royal Navy to eradicate and abolish slavery 200 years ago. But surely now, with its last form at sea, we should make that last heave to eradicate that too. As an example, we know how to eradicate poverty in the United Kingdom. Within our national crime hotspots are the pathways to poverty that generate them. And these are very easy to remember: homelessness, worklessness, educational failure, drug and alcohol addiction, indebtedness, and family breakdown. If you have one of those 6, you are likely to be at risk of entering modern poverty. If you have 2 of those 6, you are already in it. We therefore hold the keys to understand the eradication of poverty amongst the bottom 20% of our society here in the United Kingdom, and that is what drove the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. These are not my words, but those of the Centre for Social Justice and the Legatum Institute, led by Ian Duncan Smith MP and his CEO, Mr. Andy Cook, and Baroness Philippa Stroud. All of their work led to the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. For it was realized in the United Kingdom that such inhumane work practices in themselves aided poverty of the individual, but also impoverished our national spirit of humanity, without which we would never overcome poverty itself. But in our global maritime industry, we know very well that what we've done over 30 years to create hopelessness amongst many of our 1.6 million mariners, that we know that master mariners are no longer always able to exercise the duty of morale and well-being to disparate international crews. We've provided them with outsourced and offshore-based crewing agencies, sometimes delivering the lowest labor cost to protect the US dollar 100 million vessel assets that they sail on. If we've got to the stage where master mariners believe they cannot exercise basic leadership qualities of compassion and care towards their officers and crew in the way that, say, British military commanders do, and it is thought that because the British military live and work together, whereas at sea masters have to command during frequent crew changes, then we're drawing the wrong conclusions. British military commanders apply the same duty of compassionate leadership to battlefield casualty replacements, for instance. These are sadly soldiers, sailors, or airmen brought in to replace those who have, forgive me saying bluntly, died moments before. More mariners are dying of mental than physical causes. It is the same in my army, which I used to serve. Over years, more soldiers die from suicide when they come home after operations than died in theatre during them. The case for well-being is refined and well made, and I know that you can and will do all that you can to aid those mariners. But the issue of modern slavery at sea is something that is a stimulus to, but separate from the issue of mariners' well-being overall. The time for its eradication is now, and I warmly encourage you to do what you can in the British government and the International Maritime Organization so that they can become the lead organization to lead the member flag states of the world to eradicate the commoditization of mariners at sea and the modern slavery, which is its worst outcome. I know that you can and might impart the duty of compassionate leadership to those who employ master mariners and merchant marine officers to uphold the welfare and well-being of its officers and crew. I wish to support anybody on this call who would support me and the Secretary General and his officials to eradicate modern slavery at sea. I wish to support my government to turn aspiration into reality by global leadership in the maritime domain. But if we can do it on land, surely we can do it at sea. I wish you all success in your careers. I'm very grateful to Julian and all of his team for allowing me a few minutes of your time, and I hope that you have a wonderful career ahead. And if I can help you in any way, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. That was absolutely amazing. We're just going to open up the line to any questions that anyone might have. So if anyone has a question, if you just raise your hand, and we'll just work through the questions now.
Thank you, Sophia. And I'm sorry that we went over time a few minutes. I think
Julian, I think there's a connection issue. We can't hear you.
Sorry, to get my microphone up. So I was just thank you, Carl, for a very emotional and thought-provoking presentation. You did actually have people across the world on this call, so I can see on my screen everywhere from Dubai to Singapore, and we've got.
Just in case you can hear me, the line's gone, Julian. Are you there, Sophia?
Yes, I am. I think there's connection problems in the office at the moment. Julian, do you want to try switching your camera